April 9th, 1944, 23:07 hours. Over the western Pacific, 12,000 feet above the block waters that hid 1,000 wrecks, the moon hung low and dim, veiled by tropical clouds. A lone Japanese G-4M Betty bomber droned eastward, its twin engines pulsing like a heartbeat in the night. Inside, the crew of 7 men sat in silence, veterans of too many hopeless missions. The air smelled of oil and sweat, of fear that had long since settled into the fabric of their uniforms. Petty Officer Hajime Sato adjusted his radio headset and glanced at the faint glow of the altimeter. The dial flickered. He could hear the hum of the engines, the creak of metal as the plane fought thin air, and beyond that, the endless nothingness of the Pacific. They were returning from a failed reconnaissance run near the Marianas. No American ships, no carriers, just endless sea. Yet his stomach twisted because the sky itself felt alive tonight. "Signal faint," the navigator muttered, tapping the compass. "Maybe static." Sato didn't answer. The static in his headset was different, rhythmic, almost pulsing. Something was out there, invisible, yet watching. He had flown enough missions to recognize that feeling. At 23:11 hours, his suspicion became horror. A flash, just the flicker, a line of red tracers cutting through the night from somewhere below. The crew jolted awake. "Enemy fighters!" someone shouted. The co-pilot banked hard left, throwing the bomber sideways, but before their eyes could adjust, the darkness spat fire again. Twin bursts, perfect, symmetrical. "Impossible," Sato whispered. "No one fights at night like this." He wasn't wrong. For most of the Pacific War, night belonged to the Japanese, or so they had believed. Their bombers roamed the shadows, striking American positions under the cover of darkness, while the U.S. scrambled blind, their radars primitive and their pilots grounded by blackness. But that night, April 9th, 1944, everything changed. The unseen hunter behind them was an American P-61 Black Widow, the most feared night fighter ever built. The bomber's tail gunner fired blindly into the night. Tracers arced upward, vanishing into the void. Inside the Betty, panic consumed discipline. The pilot, Lieutenant Toshio Murakami, fought the stick as sweat dripped into his eyes. "Divisive turn! Drop altitude!" But the enemy was faster and seeing in total darkness. Inside the P-61, Captain Harold Renshaw leaned into his gun sight. The green glow of his onboard radar, the SCR-720, lit his face in ghostly hues. His radar operator, Lieutenant Jack Hollis, tracked the blip moving across the circular scope. "Target dead ahead, 1,500 yards, slight right drift." Renshaw's gloved hand tightened on the control stick. "Visual confirmed?" "Negative, but he's right there. You're flying straight into his 6. Renshaw squinted into the black. Nothing, just stars and shadow. And then a silhouette, faint but unmistakable. A twin-engined bomber, gliding like a ghost. "Contact!" Renshaw barked. He pressed the trigger. 4 20mm cannons and 4 50-cal machine guns erupted in unison. The night exploded with light, orange tongues stabbing forward as shell casings rattled into the cockpit. Below, the Betty shuddered, right engine aflame. Sato screamed as fire ripped through the fuselage. "Port engine gone!" Murakami yelled. "We're losing altitude!" They dove toward the dark ocean, the plane groaning, flames trailing like a comet. Behind them, Renshaw throttled down, watching the inferno spiral. He whispered into his oxygen mask, "Splash 1." it was over in 17 seconds. Across the Pacific that spring, scenes like this repeated again and again. Silent ambushes where Japanese pilots never saw their killers. The U.S. Army Air Forces had mastered a new kind of warfare: hunting in the dark. At Rabaul, at Truk, and even near Tokyo Bay, reports from Japanese airfields told the same terrifying story. Enemy aircraft attacking at night, unseen until impact. Pilots swore the Americans had eyes that could see through clouds. Rumors spread of ghost planes, black demons that struck without warning. They weren't ghosts. They were the product of America's unmatched engineering. The P-61 Black Widow and her sister aircraft, radar-equipped Hellcats and modified B-25 Mitchells. Together, they ruled the night skies from 1944 onward. For the Japanese aviators, this was more than a tactical shock. It was psychological devastation. Their entire doctrine of aerial warfare relied on visibility, formation flying, and the element of surprise. Darkness had been their ally. Now it betrayed them. Captain Renshaw's P-61 returned safely to Saipan that night. Ground crewmen counted over 600 rounds fired, 1 confirmed kill, and radar performance logged as perfect. Renshaw simply wrote in his mission report, "Enemy destroyed before visual contact. Target unaware until impact." That single line summarized what was happening across the Pacific. A silent, invisible revolution. Back in Japan, the Imperial Navy's night-flying units, the elite Tainan Air Group, gathered in disbelief as scattered survivors reported what they had seen. Lieutenant Murakami's wingman, who had ditched near Yap and miraculously survived, described it in trembling words. "The Americans, they hunt us in total blackness. No moon, no stars, and yet they follow us. Their fire comes from nowhere. It's not human." Commanders refused to believe him at first. They blamed fatigue, fear, or mechanical failure. But soon dozens of reports echoed the same nightmare. Pilots returning from missions spoke of radar-guided interception, of coordinated ambushes where entire formations vanished in the dark. By May 1944, Japanese air intelligence gave the phenomenon a name: Yoru no Shi, the death of night. In American briefings, meanwhile, officers discussed it with quiet pride. The radar advantage had finally come of age. Developed in secret labs by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Radiation Laboratory, the SCR-720 airborne radar gave the U.S. pilots a 6-mile hunting range, enough to detect and track a target long before it was visible. To the men flying these missions, it felt like sorcery. Lieutenant Hollis recalled years later, "You had this eerie glow on the screen, and you'd watch it move, and you knew that dot was a living crew, unaware they were already dead." But technology alone didn't win those nights. The Americans had learned patience, stalking, positioning, striking with surgical precision. Each engagement required discipline under absolute sensory deprivation. Pilots described flying blind through black skies, where even the horizon vanished, relying solely on a whisper from the radar operator. A wrong turn meant colliding with the enemy, or worse, the sea. Yet they did it night after night. For the Japanese, these encounters became whispers of doom spreading through airfields from Formosa to the Philippines. Veterans of Guadalcanal, who had once mocked American flying skill, now sat in silence, staring at the stars, wondering if one of those tiny lights, hid death. Because no matter how fast they flew, no matter how high they climbed, the Americans were already there, unseen, waiting. And as April faded into May 1944, one truth became clear in the minds of every surviving Japanese pilot. The night no longer belonged to them. When the Pacific War erupted in December 1941, the United States entered a new kind of battleground, one that stretched across half the planet and swallowed the horizon in blue. But amid all its power and industrial might, one glaring weakness haunted the U.S. military: night blindness. For the first 2 years of the war, darkness favored Japan. Their Zero fighters ruled the skies by day, and their bombers struck by night, confident that the Americans couldn't see beyond the range of a searchlight. On every island outpost, from Wake to Guadalcanal, American soldiers dreaded the hours after sunset. Searchlights cut across the sky like fingers of fear, their beams chasing phantoms that dropped bombs and vanished before the defenders could even raise a gun. The men called them Washing Machine Charlie, lone Japanese bombers that harassed bases night after night, rattling morale as much as equipment. Lieutenant Robert Peary, stationed on Guadalcanal in late 1942, recalled in his diary, "We'd hear them long before we saw them. The engines had this uneven thump-thump. You could almost tell it was Japanese just by the rhythm. We'd curse, dive into trenches, and wait for the blast. We never saw them, never hit them. The darkness was Japan's ally and America's enemy." The U.S. Air Forces knew it couldn't stay that way. If Japan owned the night, they owned the rhythm of the war. And so, in the quiet laboratories of Cambridge, Massachusetts, the war's most secret project was born. It was called the Radiation Laboratory, though almost no one outside the War Department knew what it really did. Inside, hundreds of scientists, engineers, and mathematicians, many barely out of college, worked under a simple directive: find a way to see in the dark. The British had already pioneered early radar, but what America built next would transform it from bulky, ground-based detection into a compact, airborne weapon. By mid-1943, prototypes of the SCR-520 and later the SCR-720 radars began testing, systems that could detect enemy aircraft miles away, even through clouds, even in complete darkness. But technology meant nothing without men who could wield it. The Air Forces needed pilots, operators, mechanics, a new breed who could fight by faith in instruments rather than eyesight. They created the Night Fighter Squadrons, an elite brotherhood trained to fly blind. At Florida's Kissimmee Airfield in early 1943, the first group of recruits gathered. They were told almost nothing about what they were flying. The hangars were sealed, the equipment guarded by armed MPs. Their aircraft arrived under canvas covers, their nose sections hidden by tarps. When the covers finally came off, the men stared in awe. The plane was massive, black, menacing, unlike anything they'd seen. Twin engines, twin tails, and a nose packed with radar antennas that looked like spider legs. One pilot muttered, "Looks more like a bat than a fighter." He wasn't far off. The P-61 Black Widow was designed for one purpose: to own the night. Back then, even the idea of flying into combat using radar alone seemed insane. The pilots weren't sure if the technology would even work at 15,000 feet.
Many early missions ended in failure. Equipment short-circuited, radar blips vanished mid-flight, and enemy bombers slipped through undetected. But slowly, through endless nights of trial and error, a pattern emerged. The radar began to speak its own language, dots that flickered, shadows that turned into targets. The pilots learned to trust the machine. Captain Hal Renshaw, one of the earliest P-61 testers, described it years later. At first, it was like flying through hell with a blindfold on. Then one night, I realized I could feel it, the rhythm of the blip on the screen. You start to sense when it's real. You sense when death's right ahead. By the time 1944 arrived, the Americans had done what the Japanese thought impossible. They had taken technology, patience, and precision, and turned darkness itself into a weapon. Meanwhile, the Japanese command didn't notice. Their intelligence networks, overstretched and isolated, were still convinced that radar remained a fragile, unreliable toy. Their doctrine emphasized vision, formation flying, and individual pilot skill. "Machines don't win wars, men do," one Japanese admiral famously said. But machines were exactly what America was building, at a rate the world had never seen. In 1943 alone, U.S. factories produced 86,000 aircraft, a staggering number compared to Japan's 16,000. Every week, a new squadron of P-61s rolled out of Northrop's plant in Hawthorne, California, painted matte black and ready for war. Each aircraft carried 4 times 20mm Hispano cannons under the belly, 4 times 5.0 caliber Browning machine guns in a remote-controlled dorsal turret, a crew of 3, pilot, radar operator, and gunner, and deep inside its nose, a secret so advanced that even most mechanics didn't understand how it worked. The radar that would soon terrify every Japanese pilot over the Pacific. The Black Widow entered service in the summer of 1944, first in Europe, then the Pacific. Within weeks, it began to rewrite the rules of night combat. Where Japanese bombers once moved freely, they now found themselves hunted. Where American troops once ducked and hid, they now slept soundly under invisible protection. On Saipan, one soldier wrote home, "The weirdest thing happened last night. We were shelled from the sea, and before we could blink, our guys in the air had found the enemy ships in total blackness. It was like they had magic eyes." Magic eyes, that's what it looked like from below. But it was radar. Cold, mathematical, unseen radar. By mid-1944, the Japanese High Command began receiving reports they couldn't ignore. Bombers disappearing without distress calls, entire night raids failing to return, survivors describing flashes in the dark, unseen interceptors that killed before the first alarm sounded. The Imperial Navy's Air Staff convened an emergency session in Tokyo. Admiral Kusaka read aloud the after-action report from the Truk air raids. "Enemy aircraft engaged us in total darkness. Our planes were destroyed before we made visual contact. Our night fighters are ineffective." The room fell silent. No one could explain how the Americans were doing it, but every Japanese pilot who survived began saying the same thing. Words that would echo through the final year of the war. "The night is no longer ours."
By early 1943, Japan's airmen had grown accustomed to ruling the night skies.
Over Guadalcanal, Rabaul, and the Solomons, darkness had once been their ally, a vast black ocean where American planes dared not tread. But that confidence began to crumble when a new kind of enemy appeared, one they couldn't see until it was too late. It began quietly. Japanese radar operators stationed on the northern edges of Bougainville and over the central Pacific started reporting strange blips on their screens. Faint, fast-moving echoes that appeared and vanished without warning. At first, the officers in charge dismissed them as technical errors, atmospheric distortions, or even ghosts on the scope. But soon the reports became impossible to ignore. Pilots returning from bombing missions over the Solomons began telling unnerving stories of American planes that could see in the dark. The first encounter. Over the Solomons, March 1943. Lieutenant Saburo Ishikawa, a veteran of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, was leading a small formation of Mitsubishi G-4M bombers on a moonless night. Their mission was to strike the airfields on Guadalcanal, a route they had flown dozens of times. The black Pacific stretched endlessly beneath them. Their engines hummed in perfect rhythm, and the only light came from the faint glow of their instrument panels. Then, out of nowhere, flashes, short, deadly bursts of .50 caliber tracers streaked through the night. "Enemy fighter!" Ishikawa shouted. But how? There had been no warning, no silhouette, no engine roar approaching from behind. Within seconds, one of the bombers erupted in flame, a silent orange flower blooming in the darkness. Ishikawa dove hard, trying to evade. His co-pilot turned frantically, scanning the night sky for their attacker. But all they saw was blackness. And then came another burst, more tracers, perfectly aimed. Another bomber down. The Americans had found them. The unknown predator. When Ishikawa's surviving men returned to base, their debrief stunned the commanders. They reported being attacked by a twin-engine fighter that carried a strange, blinding radar antenna on its nose, something they had never seen before. The Americans, it seemed, had unleashed a new weapon, the Northrop P-61 Black Widow, the first dedicated night fighter in history. At that time, the Japanese didn't know its name. They simply called it the Ghost Plane. It struck with surgical precision, appeared from nowhere, and vanished without a trace. A new breed of hunter. American crews flying the P-61 had been trained for this moment for months. Each aircraft carried a crew of 3, pilot, gunner, and radar operator. And the key to their power lay in the dark, round radar dish mounted in its nose, the SCR-720 radar set. It could detect enemy aircraft more than 5 miles away, even in total darkness or thick cloud cover. Inside the cockpit, the radar operator's green cathode display glowed like a portal into the void. While the pilot flew blind, the radar operator guided him calmly. Contact, bearing 270, range 4 miles, closing fast. The Japanese never saw them coming. By the time they realized they were being hunted, the Americans were already firing. The night over Truk Lagoon. April 1944. The Imperial Japanese Navy's fortress at Truk Lagoon was under siege. American B-24s and B-25s raided it by day, but it was the night attacks that unnerved even the most seasoned Japanese pilots. During such a raid, a group of Japanese night fighters, Nakajima J-11 Irving interceptors, took to the air. They were primitive by comparison, relying on moonlight and luck to find their targets. Captain Sintaro Yokota, one of the J-11 pilots, later recalled in a post-war interview, "We had no radar. We searched by eye and by God's grace. But that night it was as if the Americans had eyes inside the clouds." He and his squadron climbed to intercept what they believed were bombers. Instead, The hunters became the hunted. Two P-61s were already in the area, sweeping the sky in a coordinated pattern. Within minutes, the radar operators aboard the American planes had locked on. "Target acquired," one operator reported calmly. "Range 2 miles, descending for attack." In the darkness, Yucatan never saw the tracers coming. His aircraft shuddered violently, the right wing torn apart by .50 caliber fire. As he ejected into the dark Pacific below, his final sight was the silhouette of a black twin-engined aircraft, gliding silently above him, wings outstretched like a giant spider. That was the night the Japanese realized the Americans owned the night. A war in the shadows. Word spread quickly through Japanese air bases. Crews whispered about American planes that could see through clouds, strike without moonlight, and follow bombers even as they tried to slip back to base. The Japanese called them yokai no hikoki, the demon planes. Even senior officers were baffled. Japan's radar research had lagged far behind the Americans, and their equipment was bulky, unreliable, and often failed in tropical climates. The Americans, however, had developed radar so compact and accurate that it could be fitted inside a single fighter aircraft. In Tokyo, military engineers frantically studied reports from surviving pilots, trying to make sense of the new weapon. Some even dismissed it as superstition, a psychological trick born of exhaustion and fear. But the losses spoke for themselves. Night after night, squadrons disappeared. Convoys of supply ships, thought safe under cover of darkness, were bombed by radar-equipped aircraft guided precisely to their targets. Darkness, once Japan's ally, had turned into America's weapon. The pilot's perspective. U.S. night fighters take command. On the American side, the experience was equally surreal. Lieutenant Colonel Lee Kendall, a P-61 pilot stationed on Saipan, later described his first night interception. "You'd be flying in absolute blackness. The radar man talks you in, 3 miles, 2 miles, 1 mile. You can't see a damn thing. Then suddenly there it is, a Japanese Betty bomber blacked out against the faint starlight. You slide in behind, line up, and fire. The sky lights up like dawn." The P-61's design, twin engines, massive firepower, and radar-guided precision made it unlike anything the Japanese had ever faced. Its nickname, Black Widow, wasn't just poetic, it was earned. The aircraft hunted alone or in pairs, stalking enemy bombers like predators in the dark, and when they struck decisively. The Tokyo Dilemma. Back in Japan, reports of these encounters alarmed the Imperial General Staff. Not only were their bombers being intercepted at night, something previously thought impossible, but morale among their night crews began to crumble. How could they fight an enemy they couldn't even see? By mid-1944, the Japanese had begun experimenting with crude airborne radar systems, but they were years behind the Americans. The Taki-6 radar, Japan's best attempt, had a range of barely 2 miles, and it rarely worked in tropical climates. Meanwhile, American engineers continued to improve their systems, integrating radar with ground-based control, long-range navigation, and even radar-equipped escorts for bombers. It was a technological chasm that Japan could never bridge. The unseen edge. From New Guinea to Okinawa, the pattern repeated itself. Every time Japanese pilots took to the skies at night, the Americans were already waiting. At Iwo Jima, P-61s intercepted more than 30 Japanese planes in just 2 months, with minimal losses of their own. At Okinawa, they extended their reach even further, guiding U.S. bombers through storm clouds and intercepting kamikaze aircraft before they reached their targets. To the Japanese, it seemed as if the Americans had found a way to bend the very laws of nature, to turn night into day. Whispered fear. One captured Japanese officer interrogated after the war summed up the terror perfectly. "We used to believe that darkness was our shield, but the Americans, they destroyed the night." And that was the essence of the shock. For the first time, Japan's airmen realized that America's power wasn't just in numbers or machines, it was in vision. They could see what others couldn't. They could strike where others wouldn't. And in the dead of night, high above the Pacific, that unseen advantage turned the tide of the air war forever.
April 1945, Okinawa. It was supposed to be Japan's last stand, their final opportunity to repel the Americans before the homeland itself came under attack. Every available aircraft, from veteran Zero fighters to hastily trained kamikaze pilots, was thrown into the inferno. But this time, the night, once considered Japan's secret ally, had turned against them. The night the sky betrayed Japan. On the evening of April 6, 1945, waves of Japanese aircraft prepared for takeoff from Kyushu. Their mission, to strike the massive American invasion fleet off Okinawa under the cover of darkness. By 2200 hours, over 300 planes were aloft, fighters, bombers, and kamikazes, slicing through clouds, heading south over black waters that shimmered faintly with moonlight. From the Japanese control tower, the operators could see nothing but empty sky. The darkness was total, the radio chatter filled with confidence. "We strike before dawn," one squadron leader declared. "The Americans cannot see what they cannot find." He was wrong. Hundreds of miles away, aboard the USS Bunker Hill, radar screens were already lighting up with faint echoes. The Americans were watching them, every turn, every climb, every formation change, long before they reached the target area. America's technological curtain. The U.S. Navy's radar operators, now veterans of countless night intercepts, calmly relayed the data to airborne controllers. Dozens of radar-equipped night fighters, including the P-61 Black Widow and the F-6F-5N Hellcat, were scrambled in pairs. Each pilot received precise vectors. Bandits bearing 185, range 70 miles, altitude 12,000. The fighters fanned out like predators, unseen in the void. Minutes later, the first contact appeared, a lone Zero gliding low over the waves, searching for the invasion fleet. Within seconds, the Black Widow's radar operator whispered, "Contact locked, range 1 mile, closing." A brief burst of cannon fire illuminated the darkness, and the Zero vanished in a flash of fire. Across the Pacific that night, the same scene played out again and again. Japanese formations disappeared before ever sighting their targets. By dawn, over 120 aircraft had been destroyed, nearly half the force, most without ever engaging the enemy. The Japanese high command was stunned. How could the Americans track hundreds of aircraft simultaneously, at night, and strike with such surgical precision? Aerial phantom, the psychological collapse. In the days that followed, reports flooded in from surviving Japanese pilots, each more unsettling than the last. Some swore that ghost planes were following them even when radar was not supposed to exist. Others described being attacked by unseen aircraft that seemed to vanish instantly after firing. Many refused to fly night missions altogether, convinced that Japan's gods had abandoned them and that the Americans were using supernatural power. The Imperial Japanese Navy conducted an investigation. Radar specialists gathered at Yokosuka to review intercepted American transmissions. What they discovered confirmed their worst fears.
America's radar network wasn't confined to ground bases or ships. It was everywhere.
From Iwo Jima to Okinawa, every major island the U.S. captured became another link in an electronic chain. Each link fed radar data into a centralized command network that could see hundreds of miles beyond the front lines. The Americans weren't reacting to Japan's movements, they were anticipating them. A moment of reckoning. In a tense meeting at Imperial Navy headquarters on April 12, 1945, Admiral Soemu Toyota addressed a grim gathering of officers. Stacks of reports lay before him. Night losses, pilot testimonies, intercepted transmissions. "Gentlemen," he began, "we no longer control the night. The Americans have taken it." Silence filled the room. For years, Japan's war doctrine had relied on surprise, on the ability to strike unseen, a tactic born from limited industrial capacity. But now the Americans had nullified that advantage entirely. Every plane Japan sent into the night was flying straight into a trap. One intelligence officer, flipping through the latest reports from Okinawa, summarized the situation bluntly. "We have lost the invisible war." The birth of America's 24-hour domination. The Pacific Campaign had evolved beyond traditional warfare. By 1945, American command had achieved something no other power had: continuous air dominance, day and night. During daylight, massive formations of B-29 superfortresses rained destruction from above. At night, radar-guided P-61s and Navy night fighters swept the skies clean of any resistance. Japan's pilots were now fighting a war where time itself was against them. There was no safe hour, no window to strike unseen. Daylight belonged to America's bombers. Night belonged to its radar. The human cost. Among the Japanese units most affected by this technological revolution was the 302nd Naval Air Group, an elite squadron once considered the pride of Tokyo's night fighters. By the spring of 1945, only a handful of its original pilots remained. One of them, Lieutenant Masaru Sato, later recalled his final sortie. "The radar said nothing. The air was calm. Then suddenly, tracers cut through the clouds. My wingman exploded. I never saw the enemy, not even for a second. It felt like death itself had learned to fly." When Sato returned to base alone, he refused to fly again. The commander didn't punish him. He simply nodded and said, "There is no shame in fighting the unseen." The 302nd was disbanded weeks later. The turning point at Okinawa. By the final weeks of the Okinawa campaign, Japan's aerial resistance had effectively collapsed. The once feared kamikaze waves dwindled from hundreds to dozens, then to none at all. Every attempt to launch nighttime attacks ended in disaster. Radar-controlled flak batteries from American ships tore through incoming formations, guided by the same invisible network that ruled the skies. The night, once Japan's refuge, had become its graveyard. A quiet realization. In a war defined by steel, fire, and blood, it wasn't brute force that broke Japan's air power. It was knowledge. It was America's ability to see, to predict, to intercept. By June 1945, as Japan's cities burned under B-29 raids and the nation's airfields lay in ruins, surviving officers began to speak quietly of what had happened. "We never fought the Americans, we fought their machines, and their machines never slept." For the first time in modern history, warfare had transcended the human eye. The legacy of the Black Widow, once just another experimental aircraft, had become a symbol of this transformation.
Its radar operator, the unseen half of the crew, embodied the new kind of warrior the modern world would soon depend on. Men who fought not with swords or guns, but with screens and signals. From the ruins of the Pacific War, this model of air control would spread, evolving into the early warning systems of the Cold War, the satellite networks of the late 20th century, and the digital surveillance webs of today. The turning point wasn't simply when Japan realized it had lost the sky. It was when the world realized the sky could belong to someone. A final reflection. In the quiet aftermath of Japan's surrender, as American officers toured the shattered air bases of Kyushu, they found something curious in the ruins of one bunker. It read, "How do you fight an enemy who can see in the dark?" There was no answer written beneath it, but history had already given one. You don't. You surrender the night, and with it, the illusion of control. By mid-1944, the Japanese military had begun to understand that what they were facing wasn't merely a new aircraft, it was an entirely new system of warfare. The Americans hadn't just built a better fighter. They had built an invisible network that stretched across the Pacific. A vast web of radar, communication relays, and early warning stations that could detect an enemy long before he ever knew he'd been spotted. It was, in essence, the birth of a new kind of battlefield, one where information, not visibility, determined victory. The silent web across the Pacific. The first threads of this network had been woven years earlier. When the United States entered the war in 1941, it quickly realized that it couldn't rely on human eyes alone to guard its skies. So it began building what came to be known as the radar defense chain, a series of ground-based radar stations that spanned from Hawaii to the Aleutian Islands, across the Philippines, New Guinea, and eventually the Marianas. By 1944, this invisible wall of sensors had become a living organism, constantly scanning the skies, feeding information to control centers hundreds of miles away. When an enemy formation took off from a Japanese-held island, their radar signature was often detected within minutes. American operators would radio coordinates to waiting fighter squadrons, including the deadly P-61 Black Widows. To the Japanese, it seemed supernatural. They would launch under cloud cover, in total darkness, believing they were hidden, and yet, by the time they reached cruising altitude, American fighters were already circling above their flight path. It was as if the Americans knew our plans before we did, wrote one captured Japanese navigator in a post-war confession. But it wasn't magic. It was technology, decades ahead of its time. The role of the ground controllers. Inside the dimly lit operations huts on small Pacific atolls, American radar operators, often just in their early 20s, watched glowing screens with quiet intensity. Each faint green blip represented life or death. Bogey sighted, range 60 miles, bearing northeast, one operator would call out into his headset. Within seconds, the information was transmitted to an airborne radar-equipped P-61. The crew would adjust their heading, trusting the unseen voice on the radio to guide them toward the enemy. This coordination between ground and air was revolutionary. Never before had fighter pilots and radar technicians worked so seamlessly together. It turned the Black Widow into a guided weapon, a flying extension of America's radar network. The Japanese, meanwhile, still relied almost entirely on visual spotting, searching for silhouettes in moonlight or listening for distant engine noise. They were fighting in the dark. America was fighting with vision. The radar triad: eyes, ears, and claws. The American system was built on what the Air Force later called the radar triad. Ground-based early warning stations, the eyes that detected incoming enemy aircraft; airborne intercept radar, the ears that locked on to specific targets in flight; night fighter squadrons, the claws that delivered the kill. When working together, the triad created a closed loop of dominance. A radar station on Saipan might pick up enemy bombers leaving Truk at 200 miles. Within minutes, that data would be relayed to the 548th Night Fighter Squadron. Two P-61s would take off, guided by ground controllers who updated them every few minutes. Once airborne radar picked up the target, the Black Widow's pilot would close the final distance, unseen, unheard, until the range was under 1,000 feet. Then came the kill. By the time the Japanese pilots realized they were under attack, the Americans were already gone, fading back into the dark. The shock at Rabaul. One of the most infamous examples of this network's precision came during the late-night raids on Rabaul, Japan's heavily fortified base in the South Pacific. For months, the Japanese had launched night raids on Allied convoys in the region. They believed that under the cover of darkness, their bombers could approach undetected, drop their payloads, and vanish into the clouds. But in October 1944, something changed. As a formation of G4M Betty bombers left Rabaul just after 2300 hours, American radar stations in New Britain picked them up almost instantly. Inside a radar hut on New Britain, a young U.S. corporal named James H. Willis tracked their movement carefully. His voice was calm but urgent as he radioed to nearby P-61 pilots on standby. Bogey Group, bearing 235, altitude 8,000, range 50 miles and closing. Within seconds, two Black Widows lifted off an airfield on Bougainville. The night was pitch black, clouds heavy and low, rain pelting the canopies, conditions that would have blinded ordinary pilots. But not these men. Guided by radar and voice commands, they climbed steadily, the radar operator whispering updates through his intercom. Contact, 2 o'clock high, closing fast. In less than 10 minutes, the Americans were on them. 3 bombers fell in flames before the others even realized they were under attack. The survivors scattered desperately, diving into clouds. Back at Rabaul, commanders were speechless. How could the Americans have intercepted a secret night mission with such precision? They didn't know that every move had been watched, tracked, and anticipated long before their engines had even warmed up. From Pacific skies to the Philippines. As U.S. forces advanced westward, this network followed them. Mobile radar units were shipped on barges, reassembled on newly captured islands, and linked with fighter command posts through encrypted radio frequencies. Each island base became a node in a growing web of electronic dominance. When the Philippines campaign began in late 1944, Japanese remaining night bombers tried to disrupt American convoys and supply depots. But by then, the U.S. radar coverage was so extensive that almost no mission was undetected. Japanese pilots would later describe the eerie sense of dread that took hold. Even when we took off, we knew they were already watching us. The sky was no longer ours. The irony of Japanese innovation. Before the war, Japan had been one of the pioneers of early radio technology. Its scientists understood the theory of radar, and some experimental sets were even built as early as 1939. But Tokyo's military leadership dismissed radar as unnecessary for the warrior spirit. They believed skill, discipline, and bravery could overcome any technological gap. By 1944, that philosophy had turned into a fatal blind spot. while American engineers in laboratories across Massachusetts and California worked tirelessly to miniaturize radar for aircraft, Japan still prioritized more planes, more bombs, more pilots, not more sensors. And so, when the P-61s came, they were facing a war they weren't equipped to fight. The psychological turning point. For the Japanese pilots, the realization that the Americans could see through darkness was devastating. Each mission into the night became a gamble with death. Some crews refused to fly without moonlight. Others altered their routes or altitude randomly, hoping to confuse radar-guided pursuers. But nothing worked. In one account, a Japanese bomber pilot named Hideo Tanaka described his final mission over the Marianas. It was silent, perfectly silent. No searchlights, no gunfire. Then suddenly, light filled the cockpit. Our right wing tore away. I never saw who did it. I never saw anything. When Tanaka was rescued days later from the sea, he was convinced the Americans had built invisible planes. He was half right. America's sky empire. By early 1945, the network had evolved into something extraordinary. The United States Army Air Forces had radar outposts stretching thousands of miles, from Australia to Iwo Jima, all interconnected, all coordinated. For the first time in history, a nation could monitor vast sections of sky in real time. It was the prototype of the global surveillance systems that would dominate warfare for the next century. At the heart of this empire flew the night fighters, sleek, black, and deadly. The Japanese still couldn't understand how they were being found, how their routes were predicted, or why the Americans seemed to appear at exactly the right